Looks like we're good to go. So good morning, everybody. My name is Matt Cochran. I'm the Vice President of Product and Operations for a company called DataWeb.
I'm Chris Price. I'm a Solutions Architect with Ping Identity.
Great. Today we're going to be talking about continuous identity verification. So a couple things we're going to hit. Firstly, we're going to go over some industry trends and challenges that we see today in the identity verification space. Secondly, we're going to look at how companies are trying to address and bring identity verification into their enterprises. We're going to then look at a couple of solutions as far as alternative ways to go about that. We're going to dig into some specific use cases, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Okay?
Okay, industry trends. So over the past few years, we've seen a lot of activity happening through the industry that we're in. Lots of support for standards, things like SAML, OIDC, OAuth, WS-Fed a little. But lots of things going on in the identity space, lots of federation. We see a lot of people now beginning to worry about threat and risk and breaches and all of these risky events as people are authenticating and doing things. And there's also a strong focus now on things like single sign-on, multi-factor, privileged account, and everybody in the exhibitor hall downstairs will be talking about passwordless login, whatever that means. Including us. So lots of trends right now are kind of building towards a set of risk and liability and concerns around some of the early versions of post-authentication. They're really these post-authentication risks that we're dealing with. Kind of challenges that we're getting to. Things like how useful is your strong authentication if you don't actually know who the person is that registered the strong authentication piece. Like if usernames and passwords by themselves are not enough anymore in order for you to assert that the new method is stronger. Do you really know who it is that's coming in? Like they know the credential, that doesn't tell you who the person is. Similarly, how often do you want to re-verify a user? So things like, do you still work for a company? Are you still a doctor? All of these pieces around that stuff. Do you still live at this address? There's loads of pieces here around making sure that the user coming into your system, the way that they're authenticating is still who you believe they are. And then how do you do this at scale? Consumer scale is huge. How often can you repeat it? How do you integrate it in a way with all of your other things? So lots of challenges here. So when we look at identity verification today, this is kind of the landscape that we get to. So with employees, you can do it manually. There's a HR process. You have a pretty decent idea that the person that handed you the form is the person that's getting the credential, and then using that credential later on to do a 2FA type event. B2B, it's all manually reviewed, so you have to ask for an account from your partners. You don't really trust that they're doing this stuff. You have to continually verify that they're still working though, so the attestation stuff. And then customers at the end, they're doing it all with banking and know your customer requirements and all the credit checks. Healthcare, making sure that your doctors are actually there and they can prescribe and you know who they are. So loads of manual process here, lots of touch. It's difficult. This is you.
Yep. Okay, great. So let's take a look at a couple of different ways to approach identity verification. There's a lot of tools, there's a lot of techniques around how to verify somebody on the internet. The way that we think about it and the way that we've kind of displayed it here is really thinking about it in 3 different tiers. Firstly is human identity verification. These are tools like using credit bureaus, using government-issued ID scanning, and then scaling that just from here in the US to now supporting, thousands of document types worldwide, having relationships with the equivalent of credit bureaus in other countries. It gets very, very complicated very fast, and if you are a large organization, these are challenges which you certainly will face and probably already have. The second tier that we talk about is relationship verification. So this is less about verifying who the person is, but more about after you know who they are, figuring out more specific things about them. This is using mobile carrier data to draw correlations between who they are and which phones they're registered to, which phone numbers, which carriers, et cetera. Email risk analysis, looking at their background check or if they show up on a criminal watch list, for example. There's also very use case specific checks that you can do. Is this person specifically employed by a certain company at a given time? Is this person a licensed doctor? So relationships is that second tier. The last piece is environment. And so this is looking at your device, your location, basically all of the data and the metadata associated with your users at the time of login. This can also include, looking at their network for any sort of risky behaviors, looking at the way that their mouse moves and the way that they're typing when they're authenticating to see if there's any sort of issue here. So at the end of the day, there are many different techniques required, right? There's a lot of different tools out there, and in order to have sort of a full kind of enterprise-wide approach across B2E, B2C, and B2B, there's a lot of different things that you need, and it's a very, very complex landscape. Okay, so let's look at a couple of different options for enabling tailored identity verification across the enterprise. Okay, so the first one that we've got here is you've got a number of applications, a number of registration portals at the bottom, and you want to plug in with multiple different attribute providers or verification services on the top. So a couple notes here. Firstly is that the applications must plug in with many different API solutions, which has a significant amount of overhead for each application, especially when there's new ones coming on. Secondly, there's an audit and governance problem here. How do you, as the CISO organization or the central corporate IT organization, know, and how can you prove that these accounts are verifying users up to the correct point? And lastly, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of overhead with this approach. Does not scale well. There's a lot of overhead and ongoing support required. Okay, so let's take a look at a second way, an identity verification API hub. So this is a little bit better, right? You've got a central point that is now abstracting the APIs behind it, right? So all of the complexity of plugging in with multiple solutions behind the scenes, you now have a single documented API that you can expose to each one of your applications, right? A little bit better. It obviously provides a single interface to the applications, much less overhead. The problem with this still, though, is that it still requires code changes for each application, right? If you're bringing on new applications, you still have to, publish that. If you're adding new services behind the scenes, you have to update that. And again, it becomes very difficult over time.
So this should look familiar to a lot of people in this room. It looks awfully familiar to authentication years ago. We've followed this path before. We had lots of separate identity data stores. Some of them were application specific. There was lots of direct interactions, getting applications to log people in, and then governance around all of that stuff was really difficult. All these applications, all these authentication engines everywhere, trying to map that was quite a problem. We solved that problem in the identity space. We call them identity providers. I would hope most people in this room is doing that now. We have a single location for authentication, single authentication authority for applications to call. Single place to send all of that communication, single place to manage and audit and report, and then all of this stuff driven by standards. So we have these lovely federation protocols, SAML, WSFed, OIDC, everybody's using them now in IDPs, makes the authentication end of this really, really simple.
Okay, so from an identity verification perspective, what if we told you that you could reuse your existing code, right? What if you could reuse the single sign-on systems, the standards that you already have deployed in your enterprise, and enhance that further to enable cross-enterprise identity verification? So that's where this newer trend and this newer technique that we've seen from our two organizations is coming up in the industry, and it's this concept of a federated identity verification and risk hub. Now, the key differences here from the previous slide is that all of the applications at the bottom are no longer directly integrating with the federated identity verification hub. Instead, they're calling up, just like they do today, with SAML or OpenID Connect to your existing single sign-on infrastructure. From that point, you have a single integration from the SSO platform up to the federated identity verification hub, right? So all of the complexity of the API integrations and everything else, it's all abstracted behind the scenes, right? And this is a technique that we are seeing with some of the largest companies in the world moving towards this direction to sort of follow the same patterns and the same trends that we saw in the identity verification or the authentication space. Okay, one other point here is that as an output of the authentication event, what you can actually do with this type of approach is aggregate all of the results into very actionable attributes, which can then be used either in your SSO platform, your individual applications, or if you have an additional authorization engine that you might want to use. This type of tool can take multiple complex results from different providers, pull it together, and pass it down to where it needs to be. Okay, so let's take a look at two different use cases. So the first use case that we want to highlight is a Fortune 500 financial services provider. They wanted to do a fully SSO integrated KYC AML check. They want to validate the user's PII, environmental risk, and email risk. And they want to also detect risk using the device location in the network. So we'll go to the next slide. So let's step through this. This will be kind of a multi-step process. But the first piece is on the bottom left, user comes into the portal, right? They click, as they do today, click open a new account or sign up. From there, just like the application does today, it makes a request up to the single sign-on platform. That then, in turn, makes a request up to the federated identity verification hub using OpenID Connect. From there, depending on how the identity verification hub is set up, a screen can be shown to, a centralized screen can be shown to your user, just like single sign-on, but for identity verification, which is collecting the appropriate attributes to fulfill this request. Once that's done, the federated identity verification hub can actually make those API calls behind the scenes. Again, none of this is exposed to the application, but this is all just sort of abstracted away behind the scenes. Okay? Once that's done, the results come back. You can see here that some of the examples that could come back are just the straight results, the test results of the transaction. You can also do things like putting together a risk score. If this is something you're building internally, can you pull those different types of test results together into something that's more actionable, like a score? Lastly, a policy decision. You know, there's an opportunity to actually have a policy engine here and say, if the scores come back here, I want to pass. If they don't, I want to fail. So from there, the data then gets sent back to the SSO platform. Here, the SSO platform could actually just interpret the results and make a decision at that point, or they could just simply pass the results back to the application for the application to then say, I want to go ahead and provision the account or take the next step. Okay? So with all of that, I mean, the benefit of this is that you have a portal that doesn't have to integrate with all of this. You have central governance. You have central configuration from the identity verification hub perspective, and it's all using standards, using the roads that have already been paved. Okay? So let's look at one other example. This is a slightly more complex example, a couple more requirements. The customer wanted to validate incoming users' PII, government-issued ID, and also phone records. Secondly, they wanted to detect risk, again, using device, location, and network. The interesting thing here is that they wanted to use data that they already had. So they didn't want to have to require the user to go and type in their information. They already have the information of these users. Can they use that to pass it into the system and use that as a foundation to then collect additional attributes to verify against? So we'll take a look at how that works in this same type of example. So again, first thing that happens is the user comes in and clicks register. Again, a SAML or OpenID Connect request is made to the single sign-on platform. The first step here, what's different is the user is then authenticated, right? So just like it works today, user is authenticated, the user types in their username and password, perhaps they give permission to, they give consent to share their attributes to be verified in a certain way. Once that user is authenticated, the SSO platform can again make a request, a SAML or OpenID Connect request up to the federated identity verification hub, including the JSON web token or the attributes that were collected from the user as a part of that authentication event. You can take a look at what that might look like. At this point, you've got name, email, and phone number at the IDV hub. So in this case, you can see now that the identity verification screen has some attributes that are passed into it, right? And this is a pretty important point because now the user doesn't have to type that. Now you're pulling data from your existing directory that you can actually verify maybe if you don't have a lot of confidence in this data, you can use this as a way to not only establish that the data is in good quality, but also use it as a user experience advantage for the user during this process as well. And obviously, you don't want the user changing things like their cell phone number if you're going to send them, a one-time password as a part of this step. So the user would then go through and fill out the rest. Here we've got driver's license front, driver's license back. You can work out how to go about collecting and verifying those pieces. The data is then run against the top, against multiple sources. Again, the results are then pulled in. Just like before, the results are either a score or a policy decision, which gets sent back to the SSO platform. At that point, the SSO platform can either interpret it themselves or pass it off to then ultimately make a decision about what to do with the user. So that brings us to the end of that slide. Okay? Great. So hopefully you understand kind of the high level and kind of some of the inherent power of doing this. When you connect your federation system and your identity verification system together, it solves the problems not only for account opening time, but it also gives you the ability to call out to that system on an ongoing basis at login time, at step-up time in your application, and to get fresh attributes, fresh verified attributes that you can then use in your authorization decisions whenever you need it, right? A couple of examples there. The ability to reevaluate environmental risk at login time. Is this B2B person that we gave an account to a year ago still employed today, 6 months later when they came back in? These are all questions that can be answered now. Is this doctor currently licensed, and can he or she proceed with the transaction? Does this person exist on a watch list since the last time they authenticated? This is the way, once you connect these two pieces together and you have these types of relationships, this is the way that you can close the gap between registration and login with continuous identity verification. So a couple of other notes. It's also possible to, once you have this piece in place, expose additional APIs that can be used for non-web use cases. Not everything is going to be following OpenID Connect and SAML. You might have, for example, a call center use case where you still want to pull and see the risk of the users that were going through the web side of your business, and you want to understand kind of their history and the scores associated with them as well. Ongoing verification, I think we obviously already talked about that one, but you have the ability now to make ongoing requests. Step-up verification, again, you have the ability to pull in not just the typical, is this person on the same device, but more real verified third-party data about the user, which can then be used, which I think is a pretty interesting proposition. Okay, a couple challenges just to note if your organization is setting out to kind of follow this model and think about putting this type of system together. Firstly, there's still a lot of complexity with integrating and maintaining API integrations with all of these different pieces. A couple of the other points on the previous slide were, were contracts and legal, which having multiple relationships with multiple different vendors. I used to work at GE. It usually took us, a pretty substantial amount of time to onboard new vendors, and trying to keep up with the pace at which these new point solutions are coming out proved very difficult for us. That's also going to be an issue using this type of solution. And then lastly, creating, usable outputs where it is you're able to get scores or policy decisions. That's also an issue. So between Ping and between ID DataWeb, who Chris and I both represent, we have a couple of solutions that are deployed and some reference architectures available. If anybody wants more information, we'd be glad to give you demos or share that with you about how you can deploy this, manage it, and scale it at an enterprise scale. Okay?
Just closing statements on the end of this. Passwords are clearly going away. They are not secure. Just the credential itself is getting in the way. At that point, we have to worry about the account registration event, and then any enrollment event to replace a password is a critical step. We have to be able to truly know who this person is before we let that event happen. Risks are increasing. We're seeing breaches all the time. We're seeing lots of credentials being sent from all over the place who are not who they belong to from that. And then building point solutions is just not scalable. That's what we learned in the authentication space. It just gets in the way. Follow the best practices for single sign-on, federation, OpenID Connect, SAML, all of those things are great. We love the standards, and it's because the standards are the glue in between everything that we do these days. So it's lovely that we have all these new services and these new integrations that we can do on existing protocol stacks that we all support. It's really nice. We get to do some really clever things now. That's it. Is that it?
That's it.
That's it.
All right, thank you guys, appreciate it.
Thank
We'll
you.
take,
No problem.
Questions, and if somebody asks a question, can you just repeat it back?
sure, yep. Yep.
How are you verifying registration with MFA against the registration process with the first set credentials?
Let me repeat the question, make sure I understand.
During the process you described as an MFA registration, right?
Yep.
There was the initial registration that took place from the first set of credentials.
Right.
How do you correlate that to the SSO?
Yeah, it is the SSO system. So the
Yeah.
first.
So you've got on the way to enroll into the MFA system, there's an authentication event that occurs first. So at that point of authentication, you go in against the registration source of truth. Yeah, and we pull the data out as part of the authentication, and then we send that data in an OIDC call to be verified. Yeah, and then that's the bit that pre-populates. It's a set of claims from whatever directory sources you use to do the authentication. Yeah, and then we pre-populate the data at ID DataWeb, and then there's an extra set of data that happens. So an extra set of analysis that happens there. And on the return, there's a decision as part of the return that says, this is a verified account. The data that you sent me is good. The user that you sent me knows the other stuff. We think this is a verified account with a verified authentication, and we can let that through to the MFA enrollment.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you mentioned use of standards, which is great. Are you seeing the emergence of standards on the actual verification of identity side, as opposed to the transport against the verification?
We're keeping a very close eye on it. I think that a lot of the extensions of OAuth and OpenID Connect, like the OpenID Connect request object extension that we mentioned in the presentation, is helping kind of get in that direction. Being able to pass attributes in a trusted way without having to go through the full authentication flow is useful. So, but yeah, I mean, it's something that we're keeping an eye on, and would love your feedback if you have any other ideas on that one as well. Yep.
Back-end connectivity between your verification authority to all the attribute authorities.
Yep.
Can that also happen through single sign-on systems and SAML and Citra attribute exchange, for example?
Yeah. Yeah, the question was from the Identity Verification Hub to the individual point solutions. Your question was, can that happen through single sign-on to other solutions as well? Is that right?
There was single sign-on between your app and the SSO system.
Yep.
And then there is this vetting and verification authority that validates against several attribute authorities.
Yep.
And even the back end, can that be part of the SSO framework so that you're getting secure attribute exchange across a federated environment?
Yep.
Is that how it is today, or is that something that can be done?
Yeah.
I think it depends on the attribute provider as to how that integration happens. Yeah. So from the authentication end, we don't see that step. We just know that we've sent an OIDC call and we're waiting for a response. What happens next is the hub's problem. I'm sure that if the providers are doing APIs, you do an API call. If they're doing OIDC, you could do it as an OIDC call. Right. So we kind of, and it's very similar to what we've been dealing with in authentication for years. Yeah, we need the provider to be able to support these standards too.
And you call it a federated identity verification hub, right?
Yes.
So federated, what do you mean by that?
Well, it supports the direct integration with the single sign-on system, right? So from Ping, for example, the ability to pass attributes up using OpenID Connect, using JSON Web Tokens up to the Identity Verification Hub, and having them verified is,
Yeah,
that's
so-
right,
so
yeah. So there's no customization required. If your single sign-on system and your Identity Verification Hub both support SAML or OpenID Connect, then it should all just be able to plug in and flow across each
Yeah,
other.
and then depending on the use case and the flow that we're running, we either see them as an IDP or an SP. But it's all SSO stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
So this
Yep.
is a really attractive proposition. The thing I'm curious is if you're dealing with, let's say, an attribute like name,
Yep.
and you're dealing with a number of third parties, and third party one isn't working,
Yep.
like it's your system's up, and the third party you're getting data from is out.
Yep.
How do you deal with? Is it just like stop, or do you have like a fallback to say A or check B and then check C?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what we do at ID DataWeb is we have multiple fallbacks for any given provider, right? You can think about it sort of as a marketplace. So where you have a primary, you could also have a secondary, and if the first is not available, it can fall back to the second, right? It's also another advantage of having sort of an abstraction layer there, because the specific results of the individual providers can be mapped to something that is consistent, right? So the results of a name, to your example, a name verification event from provider 1 and provider 2 could ultimately be the same coming back to your application if you have kind of this middle layer in between. Does that make sense?
It does. I actually had a quick follow-up.
Sure.
One thing you lose with an abstraction layer is like, for example, with address. Address is not always valid against like the postal authentication or different US addresses. So how do you deal with like working with your client to say, you know, identity source A is proving kind of faulty on this attribute. So we're not looking at just those uptime and transaction and cost, but also like quality.
I think those are all points that could be handled by extending and building onto that layer though, right? Because each provider is going to be having different types of results coming back, and you can then take the results and sort of measure them and call other services when and if you need them, right? So it is a good single pane of glass, I guess, to test attribute provider A versus attribute provider B versus C. What are the results of all of this? This one is passing at 70%, provider B is at 90%, boom, 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 and then suddenly you can make a data-driven decision on which one to go with. That's how, does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay,
So,
thanks.
so sorry, I guess the piece that I was going to say is you pass the name of the provider. You don't abstract to say like this name. You would say this came from.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it could even be extended to being digitally signed by that provider so that you could verify it all the way through. Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Okay. Anything else? All right, thank you guys, appreciate it.
Thank you.